You may have heard that there are many scholars today who believe there is a secret within the 5 books of Moses.
The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments.
It was not originally a unified document, but was originally 4 separate sources that a redactor later combined into one.
We'll cross the streams.
Excuse me, Egon. You said crossing the streams was bad.
Cross the streams.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today we're joined by the legendary Dr. Joel Baden.
And he is a professor of Hebrew Bible and director of continuing education at the Yale Divinity School. Has a BA from Yale, an MA from Chicago, and a PhD from Harvard. That's a pretty good combination. He is a renowned expert on the literary history of the Pentateuch.
The Pentateuch, or the Torah, quite simply, is the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And, those have been a sort of coherent corpus for ever. Well, since it came into existence, it has been a separate sort of corpus within the Bible. It's the story from creation in Genesis to the death of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. And contained within it are all of the laws in the Bible. Right? So all of the laws that God gives to Moses to give to Israel are contained in those books, specifically in the last 4, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's long been the core of the Hebrew Bible, at least. It's obviously central to Judaism, but also clearly central in certain times and places in ancient Israel as well.
Dr. Baden is neither a Christian nor an atheist.
I am a Jewish professor at a Christian divinity school. And I have been for almost 20 years at the school. I've been Jewish longer than that. Yale's not a seminary where we're teaching the students what to think or believe. I have a classroom full of Episcopalians and Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians and evangelicals and so many ex-evangelicals. And there would be no way for me to say something about what they should all commonly think or believe, even if I were inclined to do so, which, as a Jew, I'm really not.
And today he will join me in being a cartoon.
I'll be a cartoon.
You will be.
Cool.
Now, Dr. Baden is soon beginning a massive Ivy League level Hebrew Bible class, just like he teaches at Yale.
What we'll be doing in this course is we'll use the tools of archaeology, history, philology, and more to try and understand how these books came to be and what they might have communicated to their intended audiences. As you might imagine, there will be some historical debunking. Oh yes, I will debunk liberally. Was there an Exodus? Did Joshua really conquer Jericho? Was David really a man after God's own heart? We'll also think about who wrote these books. Did Moses write the Pentateuch? Did David write the Psalms? Did Solomon write Proverbs? And when, spoiler alert, the answer to all of these questions is no, we'll try and make sense of what these texts really are and where they really came from.
I'm very excited to attend that, and we'll talk more about it later. But first, we've gathered here so that I can introduce Joel to the work of Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy, specifically his video series called Challenging the Documentary Hypothesis, which specifically contests Dr. Baden's definitive book on the topic.
You said that you've talked about it so much that you could potentially summarize the documentary hypothesis in under a minute. Let's see if you've honed that skill. So,
are you keeping the clock? Because I'm not gonna watch.
I'm looking. I'm gonna watch. All right. So, what's the documentary hypothesis, Dr. Baden?
Here we go. When you pick up the Bible and you open the first pages, you read the creation account, right? Like the famous Genesis 1 creation account, 7 days, and God, rests on the 7th day and all that. And you're like, cool. I understand what's happening here. God created the world in 7 days, and in this order. Right, like first the light and the dark, and it was good, and then this and then that and the other, and then God ends, right, creating humans on day 6, and then he's like, I think that's probably enough for this week, and he stops. And then you get to the next chapter, and it's like, back when the world was created, there was nothing, and then God created a garden, created like one dude from the ground and put him in a garden. And you're like, wait a second, God created men and women just a second ago. And where did all the animals go? And, like everything that I thought I knew is turned upside down. And that's because those two creation stories were written by two different people and have been smushed together in our current Bibles. And if you follow like the strand of like the logic of the creation of Genesis 1 and the logic of the creation of Genesis 2, they don't just stop there. They each continue on into other chapters sequentially, sort of weaving back and forth and in and out. And then eventually a third voice comes in with like a totally different understanding of how things happen. And then the three of those are doing their thing for like 4 books of the Bible. Then you get to Deuteronomy, the 5th one, and it's like a totally different person is writing. And that's the documentary hypothesis. 4 authors who each wrote stories that are now included in our in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books. But each of their stories has been like interwoven, like enmeshed like this by somebody who said, I don't want 4 stories, I just want one, and I'm going to put them all together. How did I do?
You were over a minute, but not by much. You nailed it.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna do it again, but less than fewer words.
Okay.
You up for checking out the video?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Everything except for the cartoon part made perfect sense.
There are also a lot of scholars that have challenged the documentary hypothesis and have argued the 5 books of Moses have a lot more unity than we realize. The documentary hypothesis is the view that the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were originally 4 separate sources called J, E, P, and D. J stands for the Yahweh source because it mostly wrote about God using the term Yahweh. E stands for the Elohim source because it mostly used the term Elohim for God. P is the priestly source, which included many of the priestly laws and holiness standards. And D stands for Deuteronomy. At some point, someone combined J, E, and P into the books we call Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then Deuteronomy was included at the end as Moses' final speech to Israel. When this happened, many stories of Israel's history were combined. One of the biggest issues for source critics is finding a text with internal consistency. As Joel Baden says, the hallmark of a unified composition, one created by a single author, is internal consistency. Consistency of language and style, consistency of theme and thought, and above all, consistency of story. So the goal is to separate out sections of the Pentateuch into different sources so that we have internal consistency across the board. Critics of the documentary hypothesis often note when we attempt to divide sources based on terms or stylistic variations. We can find literary styles assigned to P in what is a J text, or J terms or style in P, and vice versa. The scholar Joel Baden responds by noting that the defining criterion should actually be narrative flow. Attempting to divide sources on thematic and structural features does not necessarily work because themes are, for the most part, not unique to a given source. Instead, Baden says the way we identify sources is through their narrative unity and flow. Stylistic features and changes in terms are secondary criteria. In other words, in some of the narrative sections of the Pentateuch, there are too many contradictions in what is recorded. We take something like the flood account and split it up based on the differences in the narrative, like how many animals were brought onto the ark, or which type of bird Noah released. Then 2 distinct narratives emerge. Narrative flow should be the defining characteristic for determining sources on Baden's account. Baden's approach to the documentary hypothesis is a superior attempt to divide up sources, in my view.
All right. I appreciate that. I also think that's the most important thing about my idea. So we stop there. We can just stop there. That's very good.
Now, although a lot of scholars that hold to the documentary hypothesis agree there were originally 4 separate sources, almost all of them disagree on what they were, when they were combined, how they were combined, when each hypothesized source was written, and many other minor issues. There are so many different approaches, it's impossible to cover them all. Scholars often seem to be working from entirely different premises. Jan Christian Gertz says, the models continue to proliferate, but the communication seems only to diminish. Richard Hessen, speaking of the documentary hypothesis, says, the concern here is that such widespread reordering of documents within the hypothesis destroys the neatly unified interpretation of the text, as advanced by its earlier proponents. So although proponents of the documentary hypothesis agree the Pentateuch was originally different sources, they all disagree on how to define them, how to separate each source out, and when they were written.
Scholarship is a funny business in which when everybody agrees on a thing, it's dead. Then there's nothing more to say about it. And so there's very, very few things, right? Everything in scholarship that has ever been like that definitive opinion has lasted 1,000 years, right? Someone comes along and is like, let's relook at that. The very essence of scholarship, especially in the humanities, is like, let's reopen that question and let's see whether we have any new data I mean, what I'll say is, despite the fact that there are lots of various proposals for the question of the composition of the Pentateuch, like no one thinks it was like Moses, right? We all have the same data. We're all looking at the exact same words in the exact same order. Everybody, as far as I can tell, within the scholarly critical community is like, something's up here. Yes, there are various divergences in the questions of how the various pieces got put together. But the idea that there's various pieces here is not up for debate in the scholarly world. Nobody at this point is like, Genesis 1 and 2, probably the same person wrote those. Nobody looks at the flood story. I should say nobody. Virtually nobody is looking at the flood story and being like, all good, looks good to me. Nobody thinks Deuteronomy was written by the same person as anything else in the text, right? Nobody mistakes the author of Leviticus for the author of the sacrifice of Isaac. The basic things, right? Everybody acknowledges that the story of the plagues is multiple threads. But when we get into questions like, was it two texts that were interwoven by a third person, or was it one text that was then layered onto another? There's room for disagreement there. But most of the disagreement comes not in the matter of the analysis of the data. It's mostly disagreement in big picture theorizing of what the data show.
Proponents often resort to claiming this is the work of a later redactor that combined the sources and then took language from one source and added it to another. Joel Baden lists instances where he says we can see E material in J and E and P and E, J and P and J. But this seems to make the hypothesis unfalsifiable, or that it could never be wrong. Anytime there's an issue with the documentary hypothesis, just explain away the inconsistency by claiming a redactor made the change. How can the hypothesis ever be wrong if one can always posit a redactor to save it? George Fisher says, the term redactor in particular serves for some of today's exegetes as a kind of grab bag, covering almost any intervention by the ancient writers, thus permitting them to explain omissions, additions, changes, etc.
Yes and no. What I think is that circularity is unavoidable, right? In any of these theories, which is say, we don't know, right? Let's get out there. I don't know how this was put together, right? It's an attempt to explain a set of data, but without having any hard proof. I mean, I think there's okay proof, but it's not like we found a copy of J or E or P or D in the desert. Someday,
Maybe. Yeah.
but not yet. There are pieces of evidence that I think are verging on hard evidence, but that's not important at the moment, right? Every argument is circular, right? That is, you propose a working hypothesis, and then you try and make as much of the data fit as you can, or you see how the data lands, and that develops the hypothesis. And then there's stuff that doesn't fit, and you have to explain it, and you try and make it work within your theory. That is decidedly true of every single theory about the composition of the Pentateuch, including that it was written by Moses, including unitary authorship has that issue too. Everybody's got some sort of circularity. That's okay. The question is your circle very big, very small? Is it very strong? Is it convincing? Is it weak and broken in parts? The thing with the redactor is, there's a little bit of circularity there. Of course there is, right? For example, I'm reading one part of the text and it says one thing, and then I read another part of the text and it says another thing. And I'm like, okay, I got two authors here. And then I read some third thing in the middle that has aspects of both.
Right.
And though what do I say? I said, somebody is reading both of the things and pushing together and creating this redactional link or redactional tie. It's obviously that has some circularity to it. But the evidence that we're looking at, the literary evidence we're looking at, is still it said one thing over here and another and an opposite thing over here. That's still true, right? Those things need to be reconciled. This third thing in the middle that smushes them together doesn't change the fact of the opposition on the extremes. The question for me is your redactor responsible for huge parts of the text or very, very few? And the redactor or the compiler or whatever you want to call it, that is the figure who's put these pieces together, exists entirely as a function of the theory. That is, there is no redactor person in reality. There may have been, but I have no idea, right? What there is evidence of multiple authors in a single text, and therefore a theoretical requirement that they have been put together by a human. So once you say that, then the more you ascribe to this theoretical construct of the redactor, the weaker ground you're on, actually.
Right.
Right. But if, as is the case for me, I give very, very little of the text to the redactor, right? It's got to be something very striking that 1% of the whole, maybe, like, I would guess it's probably maybe even less than that, but like it's a very, very small percentage. If I was like, no, there's sources and the redactor is responsible for 50% of the final product, like then I think you're in trouble. So, again, this has to do with like, is your circle very small or is it very big?
This is why you're the best at source division.
I appreciate it.
This book is extremely well researched and interesting, but has been criticized by many other scholars. One reason being, not because it is wrong to suggest there were sources behind the Pentateuch, but that it is erroneous to think we could ever reconstruct those sources, or that ancient works perfectly preserve their sources within their texts. Take a common example proponents of the documentary hypothesis use, Tatian's diatessaron. In the 2nd century AD, Tatian took the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and combined them into a unified document. He didn't write a new original work. Instead, he stitched the Gospels together to form a unified narrative. Source critics often cite this as it is very similar to the documentary hypothesis, and that 4 documents were stitched together to form a coherent narrative. But the problem is this. If all we had was a diatessaron, and the 4 Gospels were lost to us, could we actually reconstruct them from the diatessaron alone? Jeffrey Teague, in attempting to develop empirical models to support the documentary hypothesis, relies on how the Gilgamesh epic developed. But even he has to admit, although we can see now that the epic was so extensively revised that no amount of critical acumen could have led critics to reconstruct its sources in early stages as they really were. This is the same conclusion William Hallow found with regards to the Gilgamesh epic. So the problem is not that the Pentateuch could be a composite of multiple sources. In fact, the authors likely did use sources. How much and where is debated. The problem is the documentary hypothesis posits we can reconstruct the sources of the Pentateuch because they are mostly preserved in the final document. But when it comes to any other ancient text, this seems to not be the case. Why would the Pentateuch be any different? If the sources are still discernible in the text, it would be unlike any other ancient document. And if it is that unique, why could it have merely been a unique original work?
I don't know that I would say that whole sources is the thing. What I would say is a couple of things. First of all, you can look at the diatessaron, you can look at Gilgamesh, which are different kinds of conflations of texts. Gilgamesh is actually like a layered text. It's not like a bunch of independent things that got interwoven. There was an earlier version and then stuff was added and then stuff was added. The diatessaron is closer, but even the diatessaron wasn't put together exactly the way that the Pentateuch was. But I would say this. I don't think that we have perfect whole sources, with maybe the exception of D, because it's pretty much self-contained and it's not drastically interwoven with anything else. Every other one of the sources like manifestly has gaps in it. Some of them are big, some of them are small. Some of them are probably a result of combination. Some of them are probably material gaps that existed before they were combined, right? Like I don't have a beginning for what I think is the E source. In fact, there's a bunch of E that's missing in the middle and all kinds of things like this. And I don't think that we have the endings of any of them, at least not in the Pentateuch. The reason that we are, I think, able to identify where these things have gaps, and a reason that I tend to say that we have they're mostly complete in the parts that we have, is because if you took out all of the J, you would instantly be able to see like, oh, like that character just popped into the scene. Where'd they come from? There's something missing here. Or like, oh, I don't know how we got from here to there. There must be something missing. But also lots of places where you're like, that's not a problem. That is, for the most part, the story goes on and you don't find yourself being like, wait, what am I, I don't understand this, right? Like it is comprehensible. There could be plenty of stuff that got cut. We have no way of knowing. I would say it would be pretty remarkable for it to have gotten cut in such a way that I don't miss it later, or I'm not like surprised by what happens later. That said, in this sort of like for the argumentative aspect of this, to say this never happened anywhere else, or we can't do this with other texts, therefore we can't do it here, is not, a good argument, right? Like that's like, and actually one of the striking aspects about discourse around the documentary hypothesis generally is like, you're suggesting something, and this is true, right? You're suggesting a literary process that basically is unattested almost anywhere else in the ancient world, or maybe in the modern world. Yeah. Yes, I am. But I'm doing that because I'm dealing with a text in the Pentateuch that actually doesn't look like any other text in the ancient world. Like this is a text that has a set of literary problems that other texts just don't have. We don't have texts that look like this, that look like, Genesis 1-2, that look like the flood story, that look like, the repetitions and the contradictions, even in the laws in the story. Like we don't have it. If there isn't another example of this out there, then why am I looking for similar examples? The text looks unique. There's no reason that the way it came together shouldn't also be unique. And so, I don't really understand the argument of like, well, this other text, like a Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh doesn't actually look like the Pentateuch, despite it being a long-standing comparandum. It doesn't suffer from the same problems. It's got a literary history that we know, but it doesn't look like the Pentateuch. So why are you saying, well, Gilgamesh wasn't put together this way, so how could the Pentateuch be put together this way? I don't know, Jane Eyre wasn't put together this way either, but I'm not comparing those two things. What are we doing here?
Well, let me assure you that you are very wrong about this, Dr. Baden, because Michael has plenty of examples that are just like this.
Kitchen cites the Karnak Poetic stele and the Gebel Barkal stele, which contain duplicate accounts, first in general terms, and then followed by a narrative in more specific terms. Royal inscriptions from Urartu have doublets of victories achieved by the king. Kitchen says we have an H source, brief fixed style, Howdy the Victor, and K source, detailed varying formula, king as victor, if conventional literary criticism be applied. We see deities are called by different names or titles in different sections of unified works. On the Berlin stele, we see multiple names and titles used for the god Osiris. In the Laws of Lipit Ishtar, Enlil is called by another name in the prologue. In the prologue of the Coda Hammurabi, we have Ishtar, referred to by two names, and Intu also called Mama. Multiple deities in the Enuma Elish have different names. The same phenomena can be seen in Canaanite, Old Arabian, and Hittite texts. Using different names is not necessarily a sign of a different author. As George Fisher remarked, the change between name and general noun, with or without article, seems to indicate specific nuances, according to the context and speaker. Joshua Berman studied the Kadesh inscription from Egypt, which is considered to be the closest parallel to the text of Exodus 14 and 15, both from biblical and extra-biblical sources. So many scholars have noted the style and nature of the Kadesh inscription likely had early influence on biblical styles of writing. But Berman notes the Kadesh inscription, although composed by one author, is nevertheless rife with the types of intertensions and contradictions that often lead modern critics to the conclusion of revision and redaction within the text of the Hebrew Bible. Alan Lenz also warns that we run the risk of imposing modern literary expectations on ancient texts and thereby inventing problems to which revision is the solution.
Aren't you just imposing some modern literary expectations on the ancient authors when this is a routine?
You're just teeing it up for me, man. That's how much easier could you make it for me, really? So first of all, no, none of those texts look like the Pentateuch. You can set that aside. Better is obviously where you left me there at the end, which is I'm not imposing modern literary demands or expectations on an ancient text. Here's how I know. There's tons of texts in the Bible that don't look like this. This is not standard. First of all, there's huge chunks of the Pentateuch or the books of Joshua through Kings or Ruth, whatever. There's lots of stories, Esther, right? There are tons of texts that read like normal narratives, by our own narrative expectations and presumably also by theirs. So that's step one. The Pentateuch is unique among biblical texts and certainly among ancient texts as well. Moreover, I know I'm not imposing modern literary expectations on the text when I see problems in it, because the ancient authors who were also dealing with this text also saw the problems with it, right? And that's true whether it's there are texts in the Bible itself that are clearly reading the Pentateuch and are like, I don't know what to do. And so they're combining things in interesting ways, or they're trying to make sense of it. And God knows, once you get into early Jewish interpretation, certainly the rabbis, but even the texts like Jubilees or swaths and swaths, obviously, of early Jewish interpretive texts. But you pick up any of that, the Midrash, the Talmud, the Mishnah, right? Any of these classic Jewish texts, and you're looking at people who are, by my reckoning, certainly the very best readers of the Bible that have ever been. The closest readers, they knew the text better than anyone else, right? They understood it. They were closer in time to it. So they caught references and understood stuff that we probably don't and never will. They're dealing with the same, they're seeing the same problems, right? They treat them differently because they have different expectations of the text, right? They understand the text to be perfect and divine and right. Cryptic and all of these things. And we're asking okay, I'm not assuming any of those things. What's the explanation? Is there a literary historical explanation for these features? But the identification of the problematic features, the things that require dealing with and engaging with, we're 2,000 plus years into that. They saw the problems in the text and treated them their own way. And I'm seeing the same problems and treating them my way. Neither way is right or wrong, but what we're seeing in the text, that is the issues that drive the analysis that leads to the documentary hypothesis, that is every reader of this combined weird text has seen those because they're kind of unavoidable.
Raymond F. Person Jr. has challenged Joel Baden on his belief in ancient texts must have literary unity, and that since parts of the Pentateuch contain inconsistencies, it is likely to be a combination of different sources. Person draws attention to Homer's epics of the Iliad and Odyssey. In the 19th and early 20th century, many scholars believe the repetitions and inconsistencies in these works suggested there were actually multiple Homers, and therefore there were multiple sources within the Iliad and Odyssey stitched together. Milman Parry and Albert Lord challenge this view by studying the oral traditions of Serbo-Croatian bards. They explain the existence of certain repetitions and inconsistencies within the work of a single performer, and by implication within a single literary text like the Iliad or the Odyssey. Despite the influence Parry and Lord have had in biblical studies, many source and redaction critics of the Bible nevertheless continue to assume that literary unity necessarily betrays a single author and that repetitions and inconsistencies necessarily betray a composite text, that is, a text with multiple authors, editors. If biblical texts have roots in oral traditions, then biblical texts may contain linguistic diversity that is a result of the same author or redactor using a traditional register.
Again, yes and no. Which is to say that I think that a lot of the repetitions and the contradictions that we see probably do have oral roots, just not like the same oral roots, right? Like multiple oral roots. That is to say, I think that when we find two creation stories, or even better, like we find two versions of Moses getting water from a rock. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I don't think that one person had two similar, but not exactly similar, like not word for word similar, which is like actually like one of the things that like marks Homeric orality is the repetition, right? Like phraseological, you know, the wine dark sea, right? Famously, that stupid sea is always wine dark, right? Like in the Pentateuch, you don't get that a lot. That is, when you get repetitions of a single story, you don't get a lot of terminological or stylistic overlap. When you get like two versions that disagree, again, you don't get a lot of overlap that way. Certainly, occasionally, there are oral features that are connected with stories that everybody's taking up. So, for example, everybody, as far as I can tell, knows that you use the phrase land flowing with milk and honey when you're talking about the Exodus and conquest traditions, but no one ever uses it in Genesis, right? Like it's not connected with the stories of the patriarchs by anyone, right? Like there's a phrase that's Homeric, right? Like that's a Homeric, probably oral pre-literary phrase that has attached itself to a tradition that is then carried on in all of the different authors and sources. But I don't think the Pentateuch looks like the Iliad. Yes, of course, Homer has some repetition and probably some contradiction, but it ain't like this. If you're going to go out there and if you're looking constantly for like comparanda, like, oh, let me find the thing that looks like the Pentateuch, you'd better find something that really looks like the Pentateuch. You can find aspects that make sense as something you might compare, but not the actual way that the text came into being. And I think the different oral localized traditions probably account for different versions of stories. We tell the Exodus story this way in my village, and over there on the other side of the mountain, they tell it a different way. And then those things get brought together. So like there is orality in the background for some of this, but I'm really dealing here, this is true of Homer also, but like what we're dealing with here are written texts, right? Like falling back on orality as an explanation for the shape of the text actually like avoids the fact that these are decidedly written texts, right? Like I'm reading on a page. Someone wrote them, and I've got all these other texts in the Bible and in the ancient Near East that are also written and that just don't look like this, or that share features of orality but don't quite come out the same way.
Yeah.
Isaac Kikuwata has argued there are ancient Near Eastern accounts that contain doublets of the creation of mankind, one in general terms and another in specific terms. He draws attention to the Atrahasis and the story of Enki and Ninmah. In the Atrahasis, the goddess Mami finishes her work and then says she has completed her tasks and the workload of the gods has been transferred to mankind. But then we read after this, she goes on to create 7 pairs of humans, marriage and childbirth are instituted, and then the people begin laboring for the gods. So could we conclude there are 2 creations of humanity in the Atrahasis? In Genesis, the first account covers the creation of the world and how God controls the cosmos. Humanity is only spoken of in general terms. The second account hones in on mankind and how man is meant to live in his world and his relationship to God. Having 2 accounts side by side, one covering general aspects and another covering details, may not be an indication of contradictory accounts from different sources, but represent a doublet nature of a unified text, like what we find in other texts from the ancient Near East. Thus Gordon Wenham even goes so far as to say, on this interpretation of Genesis 1, there is a very smooth transition to chapters 2 to 3. It is usually held that Genesis 2:3 came from the Yahwistic source, whereas 1:1 to 2:3 and the sanctuary regulations in Exodus that explain the symbolism came from the priestly source. Whatever the stylistic differences between the sources, our interpretation suggests that ideologically, the J and P sources are much closer to each other than is usually held.
I mean, if you tried it, like, I mean, a smooth transition from what to what, like,
vague to specific is the idea, right?
Yeah, except that actually Genesis 1 is like perfectly specific. and totally clear about everything that it's saying. That's the same thing as being like, Genesis 1 is like spiritual creation and Genesis 2 is literal creation, which is another classic apologetic, like ancient apologetic for understanding why these things are sitting next to each other but don't look the same. But like if you start asking questions like what order were things created in, that's not general specific. What's the state of the world before creation? Was it watery or was it dry? You got to choose a little bit. Were animals created before humans for their own purposes, or were they created as like, were man and women created together? Where, you can't tell me that Genesis 1 says, and he created them, male and female, he created them. And then tell me the story about like, he created them and blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 1. And then in Genesis 2, he's like, I made a guy. And like, that's probably good enough. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Honestly, trying to get around the problems in the story by like slapping things like general and specific doesn't mean it, right? Like this isn't literal. This is figurative. But all you're doing is telling me that you absolutely see that there's a problem here. Like once you're like, yes, I can explain that away. Well, what are you explaining away? You're explaining a problem away, right? There's something there. And obviously, like, to my mind, like, that's what apologetics is, right? Like, that's what you're apologizing for something, right? Like, if there weren't a problem, you'd have nothing to be sorry for. I realize that's not what apologetics means. But like, the whole practice of the thing, I think, in part, is an acknowledgement there is something here. If it were perfectly straightforward and easy, like, if it were perfectly straightforward and easy, I'd be out of a job. We couldn't do what we do.
Michael goes on to contest other examples like the flood, Hagar's departure, the sale of Joseph, and so on and so on. But I think you've just wrapped us up on a great note, so maybe now we should talk about how all this relates to your upcoming course.
Yeah, and I mean, you ruined lessons 3 through 5. No, we're obviously we will be talking about all of this stuff when we talk about the Pentateuch. I'm not going to be arguing against invisible interlocutors. I'll just be telling you what I think is going on, and you'll be convinced. The course as a whole is really, it's an introduction to the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. So 28 lectures. We're going to start at the beginning and we're going to end at the end. And we're going to be thinking about, where did this stuff come from? It's not going to be purely, entirely start to finish, everything historical critical, but that is like the main sort of avenue. We're going to talk about what historical criticism is good for, right? Why are we asking these kinds of questions about the text? What can we know? What can we not know? What is the usefulness of knowing things like that didn't really happen, or this text got put together this way, or that guy didn't really, like David didn't really write that. Here is the Psalms. We're going to talk about why it's worthwhile to read these texts in the context that they were written in, and in thinking like along with the audiences they might have been written for, so that we can get a sense of how actually very distant we are both in time and space from this text and what it was trying to do in its time and what we've done with it since. Amazing. Should be fun.
And this is university level rigor without university level prerequisites?
Yeah, I mean, this is very much like, it's what I teach at Yale, it's how I teach at Yale, but you don't have to take a final.
Isn't that what you do at Yale?
No.
You know that when I say Yale, I mean prison.
You're going to want to head over to tinyurl.com/Joel Bible to check out some of these lecture titles, including The Exodus or Not, Leviticus, Best of All Books, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, The Philosophical Food Fight, and Job. What a bummer, huh? This would be a $1,500 course at Yale.
You need money for Yale.
Yale is expensive. Yale. Stop saying Yale.
But you can get it at a tiny fraction of that price. But if you prefer no money, it's also going to be available to members of the Biblical Studies Academy. And since that link can get you a free trial of BSA, you can actually start the course for no cost to you to see why you'll love it with no risk. Again, that's tinyurl.com/Joel Bible, or click the link in the description. You'll find no finer or funnier teacher on this topic than Dr. Baden, so it's once in a lifetime. All right, Joel, thank you so much for hanging out with us today and entering the apologist arena. We appreciate you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching, and for more of this former Christian, taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.